The year is 2023. Gone is the notion of fun. We have done away with the notion of skill. Left in the ashes are microtransactions and greedy corporations designing new ways to make, of all things,
a profit.
I have read the room and have concluded that the gamer consensus is correct. The industry is in a dire state, and what we need is another
Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, 3, which listens to its customers.
That is how you make an artistic product. No, just no. None of that will be endorsed here. In a market oversaturated with multiplayer-focused games designed to pickpocket consumers, we are rediscovering the linear, story-focused action-adventure format. It is an almost forgotten fact of history, but for some time the narrative-driven single-player experience was seen to be somewhat of a value sink. It wasn't uncommon to feel unfulfilled should you drop full price on a video game that would last a mere 5 to 7 hours. While this is already defensible by comparing its additive pricing value to movies and concert tickets, there was a growing sense that video games must offer an excess of content to justify setting any solvent price tag. We have clearly grown out of that perspective, however, and even the zeitgeist is not a monolith. Fatigued by open world design trends produced by oversized teams on the death march to make some 20-hour Assassin's Creed game polished and playable, we are pressing the gas pedal on adapting cinema, harkening to a more controversial time when titles like Legacy of Kain,
the greatest series ever written, my personal obsession. Oh my god, time is an expanding layer of concentric circles, but only the outer layer is animated time.
The inner layer contains the tense facts of time and the conditional information of spatio-temporal paradoxes.
Characterization is absolutely insane. It is committed to a minimal but anti-hypocritical morality system.
And it is charming, it is dark, it is edgy, its dialogue is aristocratic, overblown, and otherworldly. This gothic masterpiece deserves its own treatment. You'll be hearing a lot about this series. So when titles like Legacy of Kain and God of War,
that is, the original God of War trilogy, which is something resembling subtlety and let its themes and emotional moments pass you by absent over-explanation, and the 2005 game in particular was received well for its storytelling virtues, but journalists have since revised a history where Kratos lacked all emotion, character mention, and
when titles like Legacy of Kain and not God of War were pushing the limits of not just engine-rendered cinematic presentation, but the precise mechanical concept of cutscenes as a reward for gameplay. Which is, in retrospect, quite ironic, because for a small slice of time, this was looking to be a dated and hackneyed method, a sign of gaming's immaturity as a medium. Aside from the interactive value delivered by the level and encounter design in a given game, there is a distinct emotional hit derived in watching some impressively well-designed cutscene. It escalates your senses and encapsulates what the recent interactive experience actually meant to you. The reception to this approach was mixed and divisive around the mid-2000s, to say the least. If video games are a unique medium with which to express a narrative, shouldn't we be discovering those possibilities in ways truly unique to the format? Others were fascinated with the fact that we could replicate the well-worn lessons of cinematography in arbitrary 3D spaces, allowing artists from all industries to come together in syncretic fashion and do their best to top each and every dimension of those art forms that the video game would heavily borrow from. We may, on the other hand, consider Dark Souls, and yes, I am invoking Dark Souls, with its symbolic and piecemeal bits of lore spread throughout item descriptions and complicated environmental storytelling, to be the apex of what I would call the imminent approach to video game storytelling. An imminent approach is one that tells a story without heavily borrowing from other art forms to carry the weight. While we may still get a few cinematic cutscenes and we'll be reading text in a way comparable to novels and poems, the imminent approach integrates storytelling with exploration and peculiar gameplay mechanics. There is evidence of this approach in titles like Half-Life and CRPG classics like Baldur's Gate as well. The imminent approach certainly has untapped potential, but it does not exhaust the gaming medium as a whole. It is one quite respectable way to tell a story, but there's no a priori reason why we should hyper-focus on the imminent approach. Our era is, if nothing else, defined by eclecticism, and the so-called walking simulator, which Plays like a movie has only been vindicated in recent years. Enter A Plague Tale Requiem, the eye-catching curveball in a duology which has captured the body and soul of a healthy niche, a matured cult, the elite cast of gamers, hungry for definitive art house entries with which we can, in turn, come to respect ourselves and the medium that has helped shape our lives. There is a collective insecurity among, let's say, artistically minded gamers. Many are almost ashamed to argue that it is a legitimate art form. It used to be the case that theater actors considered video game work to be the twilight era of a person's career, a way to cash in on your pre-existing talents in an industry that is not very demanding or serious. Yet that has never been true, and it only certainly looks more false today. With titles like Hellblade and Control hitting us in the last few years, we can look with pride on a medium already rich with storytelling possibilities, flourishing since its genesis. Not A Plague Tale Requiem, however, we don't talk about that here. Here I may suggest that video games, like any artistic medium, is a combination of sui generis properties that are themselves artistic, but cannot be easily defined or analyzed. With that in mind, we should consider every aspect of a video game to be constitutive of its art. Simple artness is a thematic property that can be only understood in the sense that
You know it when you see it.
otherwise, gameplay, the interactive motions by which the player executes agency in virtual quality space, is already an art form by itself. This isn't easily noticed in A Plague Tale Requiem, but in more rhythmic and reflex-intensive titles like Devil May Cry, we can see that the best players, at the height of their skill, are creating their own dance as they approach perfection. To master gameplay mechanics, especially when it is designed to feel instantaneously responsive to player input, is to become one with motion itself. Professional video gamers often enter flow states not uncomparable to mystical experiences witnessed by musicians captured by their instrumental practice. Yet a person does not need to have a 50 millisecond reaction time to enjoy a taste of the divine. This is where the polished and cinematic nature of A Plague Tale universalizes our connection to motion across a wide range of players with varying degrees and categories of skill. While certain segments can feel over-designed or under-designed, depending on whether you're, say, running through an overly choreographed cutscene or arbitrarily dying to rats because the game fails to perfectly track the player's location, the general case is that A Plague Tale relies on the tension inherent within the narrative context, the beautiful orchestral soundtrack, voice direction, and bewilderingly stunning environmental design to make even the clunkiest emotions feel weighty and existential. When Amicia is struggling to get up on her feet, you're not expected to just abstractly sympathize with Amicia in this moment. The way control is dynamically taken away and reintroduced to the player forces you to engage with the context surrounding the world's characters. A careful ratio between relatively simple interactive mechanics, animation introducing friction to player movement, and the careful, handcrafted attention toward every cutscene, which functions either as a reward or a function in itself for gameplay, which all services a unique kinesthetic flow that is isomorphic to the emotional context. Whether you like it or not. Whether you like it or not is a good catchphrase for the design philosophy of the Focus Entertainment development team. Oliver Rivers, who composed the game's soundtrack, in his highly interesting playthrough series of the game, which is focused on elucidating both plot elements and the musical lyricism of every chapter in the entry, shared a few interesting anecdotes in this regard. The creative director exhibited trust in their vision. It doesn't matter if, say, only 2 people in the world liked a certain motif. The point was that they can still do it. Now, the lines between AA and AAA games are quite blurry. I would suggest that budget is not the point of these denominations. AA games are becoming a catch-all for game studios that are resilient to consumer demand, or rather, how inbred market analysts understand consumer demand. A Plague Tale enjoys a beautiful sense of independence because of this design philosophy, combined with less institutional intrusion into the creative process. While it is broadly comparable to other action-adventure titles slowly saturating the market, it is neck-deep in the ever-elusive to define, but all-important property,
Vibe.
A Plague Tale Requiem possesses
Vibe.
vibe in its environmental atmosphere, vibe in kinesthetic flow, vibe in cinematic to gameplay transitions, vibe in animation and orchestration, vibe in its moody, angst-driven nature of its characters, vibe in its dark, twisted, and utterly compelling plot. There's no way to talk about this game meaningfully without talking about the entry as a whole. As such, consider this your very brief
Spoiler warning.
I do not respect the concept of spoilers.
I do not understand, nor do I want to understand.
anti-spoiler culture. I genuinely hate myself for even providing this warning. But at the same time, consider staying with me, because in the end, a good story cannot be ruined by spoilers. The Count of Monte Cristo is not a focus of literary studies because its scholars are amnesiac and constantly surprised by the book. Downfall is not ruined by knowing that in the end, Hitler will kill himself. Many times, spoilers can act as attractors that highlight a virtue otherwise unknown to you. Surprise is a trivial and minor aspect of narrative experience. Yet, our starting cast is sure as hell in for a surprise. The entire game is fatalistic in brilliant ways that is baked in to the early chapters and makes sense with late game revelation. From the onset, Hugo is already doomed. The macula, Hugo's curse passed down through the Daerun bloodline since the dawn of time, has become very strong, and it grows in response to traumatic stressors. Even if the macula could be suspended in stasis at some point, the world that Amicia and Hugo occupy is simply far too violent and inherently traumatic for this to ever become practically feasible. What Hugo needs to control the macula is a good life, but a good life is an utterly rare and nearly impossible event in history. Amicia, of course, has trouble coming to terms with this revelation that grows throughout the game. It gnaws at her and it gnaws at the player. She becomes increasingly delusional and hopeful, even as Hugo himself starts to recognize the situation for what it is. The interplay and dialectic between these two characters could not have been more expertly crafted, and is the fulcrum upon which this story turns. So who and what are these characters? We have a small cast carrying weight in a story that certainly seems character driven from the onset, but is in fact more cerebral and abstracted in its aesthetic value than you would expect. Who is Amicia? Amicia doesn't herself know the answer to that question yet. Certainly Hugo does not know that for himself either. Amicia has been entering one traumatic loop to another, desperate to protect and save her brother and maintain whatever semblance of sanity and peace her family can manage. She is shaped by circumstance and desperation. She runs on virtue and desperation as her spiritual fume. Once the Daerun family home was consumed by the plague, there was no going back. I mean, you've literally went back to the home in the first game, but that's a whole self-contained event. She has now left her home completely and utterly. She's not even in the same province anymore. A Plague Tale Requiem even opens up by showing us the schizophrenic nature of living on the road. Filled with times of quiet and safety, but not unprone to its own unique dangers. A Plague Tale Amicia doesn't need to beat us over the head with the fact that Amicia is a person with quote-unquote 3 dimensions. That is a natural outcome of the action-adventure journey. This is one interesting way where the genre of a title and its storytelling methods support each other. It is through experiencing Amicia's worst nightmares, that is, her adventures, brought to the spotlight by action and survival-oriented set pieces, that we come to understand her in a way that resists strict characterization. And how about Lucas? He's an apprentice studying to become fully accepted into the mysterious order of alchemists, under the patronage of Amicia's mother no less. In the previous title, A Plague Tale Innocence, We met Lucas around the halfway point in the game. He journeyed together with Amicia on a quest to create a cure for the macula, but all it ended up doing was stalling its progression. Lucas is in an interesting situation when it comes to Amicia herself, and one can truly appreciate how the game handles it. While not immediately obvious, Lucas is actually in love with Amicia, but does not deign to actually communicate it. I did not even know about this fact until Oliver Rivers mentioned it in his narrated playthrough. This tasteful and understated way of handling emotions is a singular but thematically representative example of the intricate ways in which this game was written and otherwise assembled together. Wrapped together with the first instances of rage in the farmstead, when Amicia finds within herself a discomforting kind of relief in violence and aggression, is the gradual introduction of Arnaud. His past is predictably obscure, dark, and mysterious, but there is a semblance of honor beneath the weight of pain, loss, and grief. We're introduced to Arnaud as a kind of villain, one that many players initially confused with the Beast, not at all helped by the fact that on patch 1.0, the resolution to the boss fight with the Beast was easy to glitch out in such a way that it actually skipped his death cutscene. Once Arnaud fully witnesses the power of the macula, he befriends Amicia and Hugo, seeking to use it for his own vengeful gains, but not without carrying the conflict within himself through every fluidly animated step, matching, beat by beat, his utterly exhausted tone. Arnaud has seen more than a few things, yet this doesn't serve us to alienate him from Hugo or Amicia. If the first game was, as entitled, a prolonged loss of innocence, we now experience firsthand the full and brutal effects of that. Everyone casted in this game has been deeply wounded by the world, and manifests their scars in ways integral to their personalities. This common familiarity with terror and slaughter allows an easy alliance and mutual understanding to occur. Nobody in the cast, not Arnaud, Hugo, or Amicia, blinks an eye when, upon meeting another critical entry in the cast, Arnaud pretends to be smuggling Amicia and Hugo through as trafficked human goods. These people are unified by the unique phenomenological vortex created when suffering meets determinate and insatiable drive. Nothing prolongs agony like frenetic ways of fighting against the global tide. This is only made worse when the world is in fact genuinely out to get you in spiritually hollowing ways. Indeed, a literal tide of plague rats may in fact erupt at any moment beneath your very feet. As such, experience and age gaps entirely dissolve. Aside from the literal revelation of a protector and carrier role, representing Amicia and Hugo respectively, nobody can act as an absolute guardian for each other. They all have some sense of independence. The ways in which they may collaborate together or save each other's lives is only born through the situation being impossibly demanding. If you were to drop any one of these people in a desert, their chances of survival would be appreciably high, which all makes for an interesting dynamic when a spiritual tug-of-war plays itself out between conflicting character interests and perspective shifts. Hugo and Amicia have become one in mind a few times along the way, but they disentangle at the beginning and the end of the story. It is all quite non-linear. Arnaud thought he was buying his ticket to revenge, but he was instead purchasing a one-way ticket to hell, littered with motifs of redemption and purpose. Sophia endeavored to start a new life, away from shady, even if economically beneficial smuggling, but found herself pulled into the event horizon centered around Amicia and Hugo. No longer content to sail the seas and live the pirate life, one that, as especially implied by Arnaud when referencing a favor she owes him, upon which she was making good as that which initially binds her to the trio, is a profession she worked with something resembling loyalty and honor. But the narrow seas are no substitute for a widening perspective. And speaking of sailing the seas, you know it is coming. You've been waiting for this moment your entire life, or at least for this duration of your life. Every YouTuber has gotta do it. Every YouTuber has just gotta do it. You know what's coming. Come on, get a beat going, get a beat going, get a beat going, get a beat going. We're doing it. This video is sponsored by
The loser watching this.
So what ties all of this together? What exactly threads these disjointed artistic items into the cohesive material that was released in October of 2022? That turns out to be a count, an island, and a dream. Not, of course, a dream of hope. Instead, a nightmare waiting to unfold. We are here to have our souls shattered, not uplifted. Early in the game, we play as Hugo falling into a mystical dream, right after the prologue sequence in the farmstead, which kicks off the Macula's progression via emotional turmoil. The dream is, in a very real sense, an encapsulation, prediction, and explanation of the entire game at once. Within the music itself, you can hear the Macula calling to Hugo, a natural sound that is not entirely human and for that purpose does not contain any words of natural language. The Macula is a seductive entity that promises peace through isolation and power. It is a welcoming sound, only heralding the darkness that is to come. We hear future sections of the game play themselves out as Hugo reacts in future tense ways to these events that have yet come to pass. Hugo is convinced that this island he sees in his dream, and that some substance or clue in that island will heal him. He specifically notes that he was dying and then he was healed. This emphasis is actually quite important. We do, after all, witness Hugo slowly die, spiritually and physically, as the spiral of chaos continues to progress the Macula. Not long after their violent encounter in the farmstead, the ensemble of Hugo, Lucas, Amicia, and the siblings' mother Beatrice seek refuge in the Red City. They are enticed toward Magister Vaudan, who Amicia sees through immediately as a sinister figure orchestrating some daring shadow play. It is quite appropriate that, upon arrival at the Dayrune shelter in the Red City, the trauma of the last year noticeably hits Amicia. We get a scene of her being taken out of the moment, experiencing emotional and cognitive flashbacks. A glimpse into the darkest depths of humanity has made her naturally quite mistrustful, and in a way that is calibrated accurately toward the world in which they reside. Her ability to see through Vaudan is tied to her trauma, as a kind of vindication of depressive realism. Vaudan is the one that casually introduces the mysterious titles of Protector for Amicia and Carrier for Hugo. His belief is in the end quite orthodox. When the Carrier reaches the last threshold, they are not only doomed for death, but must be isolated to prevent pestilence and great harm. After journeying with Lucas to find Nightshade to control Hugo's tremors, noticeably induced after the Macula started spreading again due to the eruption of violence on the road, Amicia's worst but most acute fears are realized. Vaudan has simply been experimenting on Hugo, worsening his mental and physiological state. Unsurprisingly, for those paying close attention to the story, this brings doom upon the region. The rats follow in rhythm with Hugo's emotions, and it is through solitude and suffering that the Macula designs to convince the Carrier to give in to the curse. From all of this, a war of belief rages between Amicia, her mother, and to a far more conflicted Lucas. Amicia does not trust the Order of Alchemists whatsoever. She gains faith in Hugo's dream. Beatrice trusts the Order enough to follow Magister Vaudan's original intentions. It is this mistrust and strife which welcomes back into the fold the aforementioned cast, Sophia, Arnaud, and Count Victor of Arles. Here we can dynamically go backwards and forwards, carving a perfect circle that covers the boundary of this thematically multi-dimensional story. Amicia's journey with Arnaud is non-linear and ridden with anxiety. As mentioned, he acts as a temporary villain in terms of gameplay and the storyline. But after Amicia abandons Lucas and her mother on a boat due to their fundamental differences regarding how to treat Hugo, Arnaud sings his last song as the antagonist in this story. When Amicia was still residing in the Red City, she refused to escape the army garrison rushing toward her and Lucas. Empowered by her obvious ability to fight and deal out death, she becomes blind with wrath and nearly ends up executed once she is eventually overpowered. This is part of a consistent theme where, despite how capable, resourceful, and passionate Amicia may be, there are several moments where reality sets in. She has limits. Arnaud serves as one of these reminders. Although she takes out a significant amount of Arnaud's men, and manages to escape Arnaud himself, there does come a point where it is Arnaud's decision to spare Amicia and utilize Hugo for his own purposes that ends up prolonging and saving her life. A self-destructive force of nature may deal out an incredible amount of damage in the crossfire, but it will eventually route back around to and harm the self. As the now deceased Vaudin told Amicia, "Control your flame protector, others have burned in it." Hugo has his own venture with reality crashing down on him, but is faster on the uptake. This is the central importance of the island, and it's where the character arcs of Hugo and Amicia grow in tension with each other. Once our ensemble reaches the island after a long journey, humanizing Arnaud and freeing Sophia's boat, the vibes are immediately off. There is a collective, ritualistic, and pagan celebration of the Child of Embers. Hugo is even blessed by one member of the community upon his arrival, for every child participates in the likeness of this figure. When we finally get within eyesight of the Count, Arnaud reveals his fundamental intentions and orders Hugo to set rats upon Victor, as revenge for Victor's involvement with the death of his son. Responding by reflex to this sudden betrayal, we have an uncomfortable scene where Amicia has to collaborate against Arnaud. In stopping Arnaud's duel with Victor, the player must participate in the existing power structure and feel something like a conspiring cop in the process. While there is no nobility to be found in Arnaud manipulating a child into enacting his vengeance, this is one beautifully crafted moment where, depending on your political and ethical priors, there are serious reasons to be uncomfortable with being placed in Amicia's shoes during this moment. This is, however, a form of reality setting in for Arnaud himself, that the world does not bend around his goals. Revenge, of course, narrowed his perception of reality, but there are more motivations and natural causes at interplay with each other, which stretch beyond his first-person perspective. A realization which he will eventually come to terms with. The Count, however, is initially friendly and sane enough. Amicia and Hugo are offered shelter and protection after it is made clear that they weren't conspiring with Arnaud and, indeed, helped save the Count's life. After a night's rest and skirting out of the palace's breathtaking courtyard, we are interrogated by a rightfully suspicious Sophia. Naturally enough, she wants to know why her friend is in prison, and why the siblings were treated as basically royal guests. She is, however, characteristically, or rather uncharacteristically up until this point, understanding enough and willing to see reason. It is rare moments like these that really make you ponder earlier drafts of the story. We are introduced to Sophia as though she may carry more obvious character flaws on her exterior, almost like a necessary evil with which to accomplish the goals of Arnaud and our protagonists. While it is made clear that Sophia built her smuggling empire on charisma, and wanted to lead this shady pirate life, one can't help but wonder if Sophia's character was brightened in a hasty rewrite. There is, of course, the motivating theme of loyalty shared between Sophia and Arnaud. Amicia did, after all, save Sophia's life when some anonymous soldier tried to kill her just before setting off to the island. The game gives appreciable breathing space in this regard. Amicia doesn't quite understand the honor code invoked by Sophia, and insists that no favor is owed. As such, this radical difference in values carries the weight of what would otherwise seem like relatively thin character motivation. Leaving the politics and ritual of the island behind for a while, our characters notice that the statues of the Phoenix seem to point the way, a guiding path bearing an uncanny resemblance to critical details of Hugo's dream. This points them toward the mountaintop, where the paganistic cult is in full swing of their celebratory practice. Our trio wears a disguise to get beyond the ceremony and into the back end of the grove itself. Here's where the concept of the dream manifests itself in more than several ways. When Hugo first experienced this dream, drinking water from the streams of this temple is what healed him. But while Sophia and Amicia are talking about how the cult is a lie, a kind of dream, if you will, Hugo is realizing that his dream was misleading and not a literal representation of these events. The fact that the water doesn't heal Hugo as it did in the dream deeply disturbs him and makes him skeptical of any future promised answers. Amicia, however, is still actively constructing a fantasy of her own. She interprets the water as having been symbolic, and notes that they already obtained important clues about the previous protector and carrier. We even see a scene reminiscent of A Plague Tale: Innocence, where the previous child character had a hiding place in the exact likeness of Hugo. Shards from the past point them toward a fort on the island, which Hugo frightfully notes was never part of his dream. It is, in fact, now a part of Amicia's delusions. The game has been telling us from the onset that Hugo was already doomed. We encounter a lovely bunch of slavers run by a character named Milo, who is offering blood sacrifices to draw out the rats. With the rats comes the Child of Embers. With the Child of Embers comes salvation, and, more importantly for Milo, potential power over the Count and even the world. All of this, of course, triggers Hugo noticeably, and the Immaculate calls to him once again to use his powers for a righteous cause. And Milo certainly got the result he wanted, but doesn't understand what he has called to himself. Beneath the fort, Amicia finds clues left behind by the previous protector. She simultaneously seems to have a semiotic special link with the old protector, while clearly projecting her own emotions and intentions into this residue of history. She finds a ring left behind, naively understanding it to be a historical tie, somehow wrapping the two figures together in a hermeneutic loop. We go back to the theater ruins which our promised answers lay. Hugo is noticeably hesitant about all of this. There is a deliciously uncomfortable scene where Sophia and Amicia are nudging Hugo forward, pretty much against his will. This is constitutive of the aforementioned tug-of-war which plays out between these characters. Hugo is starting to accept his own death. Amicia is in denial that such a reality should ever come to pass. He can sense that there is something wrong with the cradle calling to him, but is pressured onward anyway. And so we descend to find the remains of the previous protector Aelia and carrier Basilius. It is noteworthy that the environmental design here is stunning, filled with worn Byzantine technology and richly organic macula infestation. Amicia pieces together that Aelia found herself antagonized toward the alchemical order of the Phoenix. In their fear, they locked away Basilius, and his protector died fighting her way back to him. Once all hope was lost and he was completely isolated, he gave in to the macula. This is the same pessimism that our adventure has been recreating with Hugo. The curse is carved by the scars we wear when bearing its virginal marks. The truth is what the game has been telling us all along, and what I have been saying all throughout this essay. It is already, in a determinate sense, too late for Hugo. Not because it is strictly impossible for Hugo to live a good life and keep the macula at bay, but aggregated circumstances have already set in motion, where too many world events and personal motivations have made this so unlikely so as to be functionally impossible. Amicia, however, finds a desperate kind of hope in this knowledge. They may have fallen right into the Macula's trap. They may have worsened and re-traumatized Hugo all over again. But they discovered knowledge that not even the Order possesses. This is the fading ember of hope that we chase, desperate to undo the recent past and its consequences. Unfortunately, it is not that simple. Reality simply cannot bend to your will and to one's goals. We are, after all, in the midst of a cult and a plague outbreak. The game structures itself in such a way that we have some interesting notes of paradoxical tension. The way back to the Count's palace is simultaneously tragic and calm, hopeful and grim. Beatrice and Lucas travel their way to the island and are residing in the palace itself. Amicia makes peace with her mother in this moment, and the music is synced with this resolution. The ideological war between them has dissolved. We have come to a common understanding. Interrupting this party of unnecessary wholesomeness is a mysterious order from the Count for Amicia to speak with him personally. We get an extended sequence of simply walking to the Count and walking with the Count, making conversation about the general situation as the game builds up in quite an obvious way that we are headed for another grim turn. Yet there are many ways for this situation to go wrong, and what Focus Entertainment ended up doing was simply perfect. It is as good a time as any to talk about my personal relationship with darker and thematically heavy stories like A Plague Tale Requiem. The ending events crystallize on loss, and in theory I am the ideal candidate for a reception to this emotional motif. I lost my parents before I entered my mid-20s. Much of my family have died in general. Several important friends of mine have passed on as well. Yet, I have never felt an overt version of grief. I've always conceptualized that these things were manifestly possible, and saw life as dark enough that it was all simply a horizontal movement from one dimension of life to another. It is interesting to witness these characters care so much about their loved ones. To witness an audience that even claims to be literally crying as these scenes unfold. These people feel what I cannot. While I certainly know love, empathy, and a resonance for tragedy, I do not process loss in these explicit ways. So when a storyline takes a turn in these directions, I am fascinated with how much it does not, yet should, resonate with my soul. Count Victor Aval leads Amicia into a trap, wounding her significantly as she struggles to escape with a broken shoulder. He reveals that the entire cult is a fantasy made up for his wife, and that since it is essential for her happiness, he will be taking possession of Hugo and removing Amicia from the picture entirely. The Count is an interesting antagonist in this regard. What he does is motivated by blind love, holding on to the last good thing known to him after veterancy with wartime. Following a tense chase and stealth sequence, Amicia arrives not only to a critical point already hinted at in Hugo's dream, but the blood ritual about to take place. Her mother, Beatrice, is offered up by the Countess as a sacrifice to the Child of Embers, a sacrifice for Hugo. Amicia must struggle back onto her feet after the Count catches up to the scene and kicks her down. She desperately grabs his sword, perhaps implying a potential direction in which Focus Entertainment may take the character. Although she was full of determination and competence, a badly wounded teenage woman has no chance of surviving this situation. All she can do is fight for the notion of life itself, and for those close to her, and march proudly to her death. Lucas can only watch from the shadows, and it is easy to miss his presence in the scene entirely. Amicia is defeated in the brief mockery of a duel, ended by the Countess who, while quite insane and brutal in her methods, sees little reason for this petty cruelty. She brushes it aside as her husband sometimes getting carried away, further indicating how much she dissociates from reality. Just as Amicia is hit with a dose of depressive realism about her limitations and the nature of the world, the Countess is hitting the apex of her own dream, and in the process, slits the throat of Beatrice to consecrate the ground. Hugo arrives in a timely fashion to witness all of this, and now the stage is set for the prima macula to take hold. We receive a visually interesting gameplay segment where Hugo progressively unleashes rats toward enemy soldiers rushing toward the duo, until finally directing the plague rats onto the Countess herself. So just as Hugo reaches the last threshold almost completely, Victor Aval loses the only remaining thing he cared about in life. Swearing an oath of vengeance, he retreats from the overflowing tide. Lucas emerges from the wreckage to find Amicia desperately shaking Hugo, calling Hugo back to himself, but he isn't responding. The macula has taken control entirely. A torrent of loss overflows all of these characters. The scene fades to black as we await the next chapter. Lucas and Amicia do their best to awaken Hugo from his internal void, and in brief moments where they do elicit a response, it is not always Hugo that surfaces. The macula makes itself known as a truly alien and malicious force. Some of the best environmental design and general art that I have ever seen shines through this sequence where our protagonists have to walk past and escape the nest that acts as one of the beating hearts of the macula itself. Once they make it back to the general city, however, Hugo overhears Arnaud's incoming execution, and this resurfaces his personality long enough to morally nudge Amicia in the right direction. While it may be convenient to leave Arnaud to his fate, the relationship was filled with distrust and bitterness anyway. In an interesting way, Hugo acts as a moral illumination for all of these characters as we approach the finale. We liberate Arnaud from his chains after a fairly interesting wave-by-wave encounter that tests all of the abilities he's learned so far. Amicia desperately tries to console Hugo about the loss of their mother, further hitting home that the curse is two-dimensional. Not only is it intensified by trauma, but our reflexive desire to seek out solutions brings about the cosmic winds that carry us out of the existential picture entirely. Chapter 14, entitled Healing Wounds, acts as a plausible fake-out ending. We are allowed to spend some time wandering the ship, engaging in optional dialogue that adds further depth to this unlikely cast, but the goal is clear: find somewhere safe to rebuild their lives and raise Hugo away from violence and terror. All that was needed all along was what they already possessed. After we are done with floating in Normiville, true to his promise, Count Victor Aval makes his threatening presence known on the horizon. No happy endings here. Fueled with vengeance, Victor successfully boards the ship, and Amicia is near fatally wounded in the resulting brawl. Worse still, Hugo is captured by a frenzied Count, who has designs for Hugo because the Count has only one thing in life to fall back on: war. Shipwrecked and scattered, Arnaud tends to Amicia's wounds and oversees her health on the shoreline. The Count is, of course, not far away, and in a touching scene we see the final resolution of tension between Arnaud and Amicia. Primed and ready to go after the Count, Amicia reflexively concludes that this is all about his revenge again. She would rather deal with Victor herself. But it is made clear that Amicia is not in an ideal condition for the task. Moreover, and more importantly, Arnaud has come to care for Hugo, and understand the world-bearing importance of seeing that this child is not manipulated into becoming the prima macula. This begins a pretty interesting gameplay encounter, particularly on the hardest difficulty. There's a thick and vibe-defining fog getting in the way of your sight, as enemies of every variety, with minimal resources and cover to back you up, are likely to end your life at a moment's notice. A satisfying rhythm and dance of emotion is achieved when you find the right balance of creative alchemy, chokehold stealth, reflexive awareness, and moments of opportunity seized to survive the encounter. We hear lively atmospheric dialogue between Arnaud and the Count while they clash. Vocalizing what was already implicit, Arnaud has found a purpose beyond himself, whereas Victor is retreated entirely into his internal demons. It is revealed that Hugo is being kept in Marseille, where it is only a matter of time that, should Amicia die or not, Hugo will reach this dark conclusion for himself and give in to the macula. The duel resolves in a beautiful and flourishing fashion. Falling to a fatal blow and impaled upon the Count's sword, Arnaud, in a death-defying effort, pulls the sword into himself, staying alive long enough to release Victor's helmet and allow Amicia to land the killing blow with her sling. Arnaud's passing is serene and beautiful on a thematic and visual level. Lucas notes the prophesied dying of the sun, and along with Sophia, they desperately ride for Marseille by carriage. A contemporary take of a turret section of all things is placed here, but functions as visual rather than mechanical gameplay in this instance. An emotional tone to build up the journey to the grand finale. For we are reaching the climax where King Hugo reigns in his realm. Upon reaching the ruined city, the cast notes that the scene is similar to how Hugo would naturally react to traumatic scenarios, retreating into himself and playing castle. This ties well into the prologue where Lucas must find Hugo and Amicia who are sneaking around a literal castle, which rhymes with the nebula in which all natural laws break down. The nebula is truly a visual feast to behold, and it stays within your mind long after the story has come to a close. Sophia herself is wounded in the rush toward the sea and the likely location of Hugo, where the macula is taken over entirely and seems to threaten the world itself. I noted earlier that the role between child and adult is fluid within this game. On the island, Sophia even scolds Amicia in a stereotypically and over-the-top grown-up tone, but here it is Amicia that has to ensure Sophia that it's okay to let go this once. This is Amicia's mission, not strictly hers. The rush to the nebula begins in a simple but cinematically interesting run toward the water. Rats are thrown at you in waves, and you can feel the desperation of Lucas and Amicia as they dive straight ahead into their suicidal move. And so the end begins. We enter a breathtakingly inspired, picturesque scene, throwing the symbolism of the prior chapters at you in schizophrenic fashion. These last moments function as a spiritual dialogue between Hugo and Amicia, where, just as the player has to directly unlearn everything the game has taught them in order to progress, Hugo has to communicate to Amicia how one can truly let go. Fighting the inevitable at this point is not going to cut it. It is time for everyone to face reality. There are phoenix idols in this mystical dimension illuminating the apparent path, but these are just a misdirection. Just as the island, the alchemical order of the Phoenix, and the guiding statues in Chapter 9 were all lies that served the macula. The player has to run away from the Phoenix, rather than follow arcane misdirections, born from desperation. To further hammer this home, Amicia is trapped in an infinite loop of fighting humanoid constructions of plague rats amidst a terrifying sculpture of skulls and death. One may be inclined to fight these enemies, to see it as a test of their reflex, to keep the flame alight, for it is the source of their safety, but eventually it becomes clear what Amicia must do. Upon extinguishing the flame and giving up, the shape of truth is revealed. A distorting veil is lifted from our sight. We walk through representations and dimensions of suffering in the outside world, and the journey so far. Amicia heavily resists what Hugo is gently guiding her to do, concluding that this must be a trick of the macula. Yet the macula would not inflict a fatal wound upon its critical host. Our solution is ominously clear. We get a look at Hugo suspended in macular overgrowth as Lucas catches up with the siblings in just the exact way reminiscent of playing hide and seek in the prologue. player receives a limited amount of time to do what is necessary. Amicia whips the sling and kills her brother. We have covered a hard-hitting story that meant a lot to me, and I hope you extracted some meaning from it too. Rather than go over themes already talked about in a distinct conclusion section, I would instead read a poem that I wrote about this beautiful series. Where there is nothing but sorrow, we find peace lying in wait for us. Dissociation imminent to being itself, such is our tonal plight. Where anguish and suffering are univocal, loss, grief, and strife is all we know. Strength lies in accepting demonic darkness, for nature is our purifying hell. Where tensions with other people grow, entangled in knots that may pull apart, such broken threads are new material to build towards sublative heights. There is no carrier of exile, no protector overseeing realms, only fire burning within the mind, rekindling our self-destructive embers. A universe bringing only confusion, dynamic and twisted in apparent hate. The compassion that kills is a deadlier sin than rage. For we are nothing but vain shadow plays, reflecting the cosmic current of exquisite misery. In the end we stand alone, disconnected. We are not listening to ourselves.